Comic book industry superstar Mark Waid once wrote that the role of an editor is to facilitate the creative process, not impose on it. That sounds easy, but it's rare for a mainstream comic book story to remain completely untouched by the heavy hands of an editor. Typically, the higher a storyline's profile, the more likely someone from Editorial will step in to make sure it sells. There are, however, instances where the powers that be push so hard that it causes irreparable damage. I'm Rue from What Culture, and this is 10 amazing comic book storylines derailed by editorial politics. 10. The Trials of Tribe. After its successful debut as an independent publishing company in 1992, Image Comics hired an executive director to oversee financial affairs and make sure creatives met their deadlines. As a result of this tighter ship, one of the titles that was jettisoned was Todd Johnson and Larry Stroman's Tribe. Tribe 1, which sold more than 1 million copies, was noteworthy for being the best-selling comic to be produced by African-American creatives. Johnson and Stroman intended for their super team to eventually consist of more than 200 members, but that idea never came to fruition. The duo was notorious for missing deadlines. Eventually, Image cancelled the series before a second issue could even be produced. Tribe was eventually picked up by Axis Comics, which published issues 2 and 3, but then Axis went bankrupt and folded. A fourth and final issue, Tribe 0, was published by Good Comics, but by that point, the magic had long gone. 9. Jim Starlin quits Warlock. Jim Starlin was one of the godfathers of Marvel's cosmic universe, having created comic book mainstays such as Thanos, Gamora, and Drax the Destroyer, and generating interest in failing characters such as Captain Marvel and Adam Warlock. During Starlin's run on Warlock, which included a universally loved story pitting the Golden Guy against his evil self Magus, the writer-artist clashed with Marvel's editor-in-chief, Jerry Conway. Starlin was made aware of art corrections and demanded the opportunity to make changes. Conway refused, so Starlin quit, ending his run on one of the most successful cosmic comics ever. When Archie Goodwin took over from Conway, Starlin was eventually wooed back to script and pencil a 2-part Warlock Thanos story in Avengers Annual 7. But in the opening pages of the first story, the reader sees that Gamora has died without explanation. Starlin told Newsarama that this would have been explained in Warlock 16, but the issue never saw the light of day because of his rift with Conway. 8. The end of the Stern-Byrne run on Captain America. Roger Stern and John Byrne's work on Captain America in the early 1980s was as short-lived as it was acclaimed. The duo breathed new life into the character, including a very well-received standalone issue wherein Captain America considers running for president. Both quit after 9 issues due to clashes with Marvel's editorial department. Marvel's editors were worried about deadlines and insisted on hiring a one-off fill-in creative team. This would have disrupted Stern and Byrne's bonus for working a 6-issue run. The lost royalties, with concerns that the substitute team would cost the book a chunk of its readership, is what ultimately led to Stern and Byrne resigning from the series. 7 is One More Day. Peter Parker's marriage to supermodel girlfriend Mary Jane Watson was a polarizing moment for Marvel's circle of creators and editors. Some thought it made the character more relatable, while others thought it was harder to identify with a middle-age-ish superhero who had husbandly responsibilities. Regardless, the Peter-MJ dynamic was at its very best when written by Amazing Spider-Man scribe J. Michael Straczynski, who reunited the couple after a multi-year separation in the early 2000s. But despite all of the excellent Peter MJ stories, he was tasked by Marvel editor-in-chief Joe Quesada with breaking them up for good. Straczynski was reluctant to do a story dubbed One More Day, and even asked to have his name taken off the comic in protest, but he later backed off as not to sabotage the project. Quesada remained adamant that the series would be better off without MJ, so the story went forward and became what many consider as one of Spidey's worst. In its setup, Aunt May is shot by a sniper bullet and Peter's offered a deal by Marvel's devil Mephisto. He can save May, but in exchange for his marriage. Readers were shocked that Peter accepted. 20 years of continuity were wiped from existence and Spider-Man made a deal with the devil, which didn't seem in character. 6. Well, it's the cancellation of Supergirl. Peter David's critically acclaimed Supergirl was on the verge of cancellation in 2002 when he convinced the powers that be at DC to revive the original Supergirl, Kara Zor-El, whose death in the Crisis on Infinite Earth was one of the most iconic moments in comic book history. She would join forces with David's newer incarnation of Supergirl, Linda Danvers. DC agreed to this resurrection under the condition that it was for a 6-issue arc. David had bigger plans though, and he wanted some extra time to make his case. He told Comics Should Be Good that he hoped a revived interest in Supergirl would lead to a new team book starring Kara, Linda, and Power Girl. Sales did pick up during the arc, and the story was warmly received by critics and fans, but DC stuck to its guns and at the end of its run, cancelled the series. In at number 5, Heroes Reborn. In a move that shocked the industry and was, as one editor described, catastrophic to morale, Marvel killed the Avengers, Fantastic Four, Doctor Doom, and a host of other characters as part of their Onslaught event in 1996. They relaunched the Avengers, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Captain America, but Marvel relinquished control of its characters and paid millions to Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld to create these core titles. That's 2 artists who defected to Form Image a few years earlier. Long-serving Marvel creators were unceremoniously kicked to the curb. This was of course met with harsh criticism, and even though it was fiscally motivated, Heroes Reborn didn't help sales. A year later, Marvel ended its experiment and reintroduced all the heroes under the banner Heroes Return. Nice. And 4. The Death and Return of Jean Grey. The Dark Phoenix Saga is widely considered one of the greatest comic book stories ever created, and yet the story was strongly guided by editorial input that had a negative impact on Marvel years after it was first published. In its original form, the creative team, Chris Claremont and John Byrne, intended for Jean Grey, who had been consumed with the dark cosmic Phoenix Force, to atone for her sins, which included the destruction of an entire planet, and survive the ordeal. But Marvel's editor-in-chief Jim Shooter refused to publish the story unless Jean faced legitimate consequences for her actions. Shooter essentially dared Claremont to kill her, and he did just that in the arc's final chapter in Uncanny X-Men 138. As it worked out, Shooter's interference arguably made for a better story, but by the mid-1980s, Byrne had moved on to begin an epic run, writing and penciling Fantastic Four. During this time, Marvel decided to resurrect Jean for its new X-Factor series. As suggested by a fan, who became future comic book writer Kurt Busiek, Jean's body was found in a cocoon in Jamaica Bay. It was revealed that the Phoenix Force was only impersonating her during the Dark Phoenix Saga. Claremont continued to take ownership of the character, and according to Marvel Comics' The Untold Story, he convinced Shooter to change 2 of Byrne's pages in Fantastic Four. And with that, Byrne left his contract with Marvel for DC, where he played a key role in rebooting Superman in the mid-1980s. 3 is the Hobgoblin Saga. The reveal of Hobgoblin's identity is considered one of the most poorly executed storylines in company history. Roger Stern and John Romita Jr. first introduced the character in The Amazing Spider-Man 238, and planned to keep his identity secret for a fair while before revealing him as a wealthy businessman, Roderick Kingsley, with a lookalike brother. But Stern and John Romita Jr. left the book before finishing the story. Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz took over and wanted to take the Hobgoblin in a different direction. According to interviews, DeFalco wanted to reveal Richard Fisk, son of Wilson Fisk, the kingpin of crime, as the Hobgoblin. Kingsley was slated to be another criminal, the Rose. But DeFalco and Friends clashed with Spider book editor Jim Owsley. At one point, Owsley demanded that DeFalco reveal the Hobgoblin's identity to the press, so the writer told the reporters it was mild-mannered Daily Bugle reporter Ned Leeds. Owsley fired him and laid waste to what he thought were plans for the Hobgoblin. In the Spider-Man vs. Wolverine one-shot that Owsley wrote, he killed off Leeds. Then he asked upstart writer Peter David to pen the Hobgoblin reveal with someone else under the mask. David, thrust into an unwinnable situation, decided to write the story based on the information presented in the comics. He concluded that Leeds was the Hobgoblin, despite the fact that he had been killed. The story was met with scorn and disappointment from fans who at one point thought the Hobgoblin was one of the best villains ever created in the Spider-Man universe. About 10 years later, Stern retconned the awful decision, revealing that Kingsley had had brainwashed leads into thinking he was the Hobgoblin, but the damage was already done. 2 is Miracle Man. The saga of Marvel Man, aka Miracle Man, is one of the most complicated in comic book history. Strap in. In 1953, American publisher Fawcett Comics discontinued its series, Captain Marvel, due to a lawsuit from DC, who claimed it was too similar to Superman. But because British publishers L. Miller and Son were already publishing black and white reprints of the series, comic packager Mick Anglo was brought in to repurpose the character as Marvel Man instead. In order to retain the title's audience, Miller continued to use logos and trademarks that were similar to what Fawcett had produced, giving the impression that Marvel Man was in fact still Captain Marvel. Anglo's association with Miller ended in 1960, and the packager recycled some of his Marvel Man stories as Captain Miracle. But by August 1985, another publisher, Eclipse, had started printing colorized versions of Marvel Man, renaming the series Miracle Man to avoid any legal complications. At issue 16, Neil Gaiman took over alongside artist Mark Buckingham, continuing until 1994 when Eclipse went bankrupt. Then, in 1996, Todd McFarlane purchased Eclipse assets, including, he believed, Miracle Man, despite Gaiman claiming he still maintained ownership of the character. Gaiman sued McFarlane over ownership of the character in 2002. But as it turned out, Skin never had the rights to sell the Eclipse portfolio to McFarlane in the first place. The sale was nullified. At New York Comic Con, Marvel announced it had purchased the rights to Miracle Man, and in January started reprinting the series. And in the #1 spot, the New 52. DC made a controversial decision in 2011 to relaunch its entire line of comics and erase years of continuity. Clark Kent and Lois Lane were no longer married, and all kinds of other notable events were retconned. This major revamp brought with it a slew of editorial issues that derailed a number of comics that were part of the launch. Within the first year, legendary artist George Perez left Superman, while industry firebrand Rob Liefeld left his 3 titles in an effort to preserve his sanity. The biggest controversy came about when Batwoman creators J.H. Williams and W. Hayden Blackman announced via Twitter that they had quit, citing massive editorial interference. Batwoman Kate Kane had proposed to her girlfriend Maggie Sawyer in what would have been the industry's first lesbian marriage. However, DC Editorial told Williams and Blackman that this couldn't go ahead. Williams said the decision wasn't anti-gay, rather driven by the fact that the publisher didn't want any of its characters getting married at all. Regardless, this interference became a PR nightmare for DC. So which comic book mishaps, exits, or unexplained mysteries have irked you since you started reading? Leave a comment below to let us know. But in the meantime, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.